In this chapter, we'll be dealing with the neoclassical approach to production and distribution. Then we'll talk about market failure, and then we'll go into the public sector. We'll talk about the ways in which the public sector intervene, and we'll go into government intervention and also just touch on government failure. Okay, so why do we study the neoclassical approach? It remains the dominant approach in academia. In your micro course, you learn the neoclassical approach. What underlies modern macro is neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics is just the extension of what we call classical economics. So the classical economists were the people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, etc. And around the late 19th century, we had people like Jevons, Valra, and also Marshall. And these guys introduced things like the marginal approach to microeconomic analysis, and developed this idea of equilibrium in the economy. And of course, all of this culminated. Samuels wrote the textbook, I think, in the 50s, which was one of the most comprehensive sort of treatments of this neoclassical approach to doing economics. Okay, so it remains the dominant approach, and this might not be the case forever. In our first session, I talked about how economics is moving into a more empirical sort of paradigm, and there are people who entirely eschew the more formal modeling that we learn in our micro and macro courses for more empirical approaches to doing economics. Also, it offers a somewhat flexible analytical framework for policy analysis and has consistent welfare properties. So when you do microeconomics in, I think, your honors year, perhaps even in your third year, you'll develop these welfare theorems. These properties sort of pop out of the model, given certain assumptions, of course. Okay, central features of the neoclassical approach, that is, it is fundamentally market-based, which is why it falls out of favor in some quarters. It is premised on rational decision-making among individuals. Economists know that people don't always behave in a rational manner. And what we mean when we talk about rationality in economics is that people are consistent in their decision-making. All right, and then we have this equilibrium concept in economics. Again, not everyone is a fan of this idea of equilibrium, that it's necessary. Some people would view the economy as more of an emergent system rather than one that has an equilibrium. And another controversial feature of the neoclassical approach is that it takes initial distributions as given, and we'll talk more about this as we go on. Okay, so let's go into the assumptions of the neoclassical benchmark model. Okay, so we start out with two individuals, A and B, with initial endowments of capital and labor. Okay, just to alert you, I am following the notation from the textbook. Sometimes it vacillates between capital letters and lowercase letters, so don't let that confuse you. Whether it's capital K or lowercase k, K is capital in this exercise. Okay, likewise for any other notation. Okay, so we start out with two individuals. We'll call them A and B. They have some initial endowments of capital and labor. In other words, A and B have some, between the two of them, they have some share of the total capital in the economy, and they have some share of the labor in the economy. And labor doesn't have to be split equally between A and B. You can think of labor in a very broad sense in this case. Labor could include things like human capital. So A might know how to do a lot more stuff than B, right? So therefore A has a greater share of the total labor endowment in the economy than does B in that case. Okay. So just making this point to highlight that shares of capital and labor are not split equally between A and B necessarily. Okay. The two individuals supply these factors of production to firms that they own. You don't have to think about firms as being these separate things. the individuals could themselves be the firms. The point is that capital and labor are used in the production process, right? So there's some production technology that gets used in this economy to produce two goods, X and Y. Okay? So there are two sectors in the economy. One of the sectors produces good X, the other sector produces good Y. And these two individuals consume X and Y only. Okay? So they are the two consumers. They own all the capital, all the labor, and they consume all of the produce that comes from that capital and labor put to service through a particular production technology. So the production technology uses any combination of capital and labor, but has diminishing marginal product. And of course, capital and labor are themselves finite in quantity, right? There is perfect competition in the commodity and factor markets. This is an important assumption because, as you know from your microeconomics courses, perfect competition ensures that marginal cost equals price, and for the ratio of marginal utilities equals the ratio of prices, right? Also, there are no externalities to production. You can already see some divergence between the model and reality. And individuals have fixed preferences expressed within difference curves having diminishing marginal rates of substitution. And of course, this assumption is necessary for us to do any kind of analysis with this type of framework, because we won't have the smooth difference curves that we like to have, right? Individuals have perfect information with respect to the environment as well, another very important assumption. So you'll notice that a lot of these assumptions are very simplified and somewhat unrealistic, right? So this is clearly not a model that is going to provide you with an accurate description of the world that we observe around us. Now, this is what you might call a normative analytical framework. So in session one, we distinguish between normative views and positive views, or normative and positive statements. And we can also do normative and positive analysis, right? So a positive analysis would typically be something like looking at data, right? So just gathering data, perhaps do some econometric analysis, or just look at the data to determine whether the government policy met its goals, whether it worked or not. A normative analysis, on the other hand, might look at whether the government policy makes sense from an analytical perspective, right? And to do that, you use something like perhaps the neoclassical model, right? So if you implement this policy in a neoclassical setting, what would the impact of it be, right? So the neoclassical framework, hence, is an idea of normative analysis, how the world ought to work. Now, let me just say that this is one view of how the world ought to work, right? So, and we'll talk about why people might differ with this view, with this normative analysis. Okay. And this analysis looks at how an efficient allocation of resources comes about, which maximizes welfare regardless of the positive reality. Okay. So on this slide, I just distinguish between the three types of efficiency that are talked about in the textbook. Usually we talk about two types of efficiency. We have allocative efficiency and X efficiency, also called technical efficiency. The X in X efficiency just refers to the fact that we are talking about anything other than allocative efficiency. Okay, the textbook also has a third efficiency concept, which the authors call dynamic efficiency. And by dynamic efficiency, what they mean is growth, economic growth, right? Technical efficiency just means that production is being maximized, right? That resources are allocated in the economy in such a way that we are maximizing the production of X and Y. Nothing is being wasted. In other words, we're on the possibilities frontier of the economy, right? We're not inside the PPF or the PPC, the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier. Allocative efficiency, on the other hand, means that resources are allocated in accordance with consumer preferences. And underlying both of these is a welfare concept, right? If we are wasting any resources in our production technology, it means that we are not maximizing welfare because we are not on the PPC, we're not producing as much as we can be producing. And if we don't have allocative efficiency, obviously, consumers' preferences are not being met, right? So there's no point in having technical efficiency, having maximum production capacity, but all we're doing is producing paper clips, something that people don't want. Right. And as I mentioned, dynamic efficiency just means growth. It just means pushing out the production possibilities frontier, or PPC. Okay. So this slide talks a little bit more about allocative efficiency. So in the economy, it implies that an optimal mix in accordance with consumer preferences of goods and services are produced. In our simple two-sector, two-good model, this means that sufficient quantities of X and Y are produced in order that consumers maximize their respective utilities. The interaction between consumption and production is coordinated by prices under the assumption of perfect competition, which means that the prices accurately reflect the cost of production. Okay, to achieve allocative efficiency, there are three conditions necessary. And these are Pareto optimality in consumption, Pareto optimality in production, and the simultaneous occurrence of these two things, right? So simultaneous equilibrium in production and consumption. All right. So this slide summarizes these three conditions that are required for allocative efficiency. So again, we're doing an overview here. We're not going to write down and solve all the equations to get to these results. We're just asserting these results here, right? But this should be familiar to you from your micro courses. So the Pareto optimality in consumption says that the marginal rate of substitution for consumer A, that is substitution between good X and Y, is equal to the ratio of the prices of these goods, and that is also in turn equal to the marginal rate of substitution between goods X and Y for consumer B. Effectively, what this means is that the slopes of the respective utility functions are equal. And that is the first condition for Pareto optimality in consumption. And of course, the marginal rate of substitution relates to how much of good X, A, and B, respectively, are willing to give up to consume more of good Y, and vice versa. And they optimize that. They reach this condition specifically through exchange, through trade. Okay. Then the second condition for allocative efficiency is Pareto optimality in production. So this is a similar condition. So recall PX, PY, that's respectively the price of good X, the price of good Y, and under the assumption of perfect competition in the goods market, these prices reflect the marginal utilities of for these respective goods for the two consumers. And W and R in the next relation are the prices of labor and capital, effectively, right? You can think of it as the costs of labor and capital. Here we have the marginal rate of technical substitution. So this concept is very similar to the marginal rate of substitution, except that here it applies to firms. And this equals the ratio of the marginal product of labor and the marginal product of capital, which in turn equals the ratio of the costs of production, which are the costs of labor, wage rate, and the cost of capital R. Okay, which is also the return to capital in this economy. Okay, so this relation is what we need to achieve Pareto optimality in production. And we're going to look at sort of what this means in a graphical sense in the slides to follow. And then finally, the third condition is that we have simultaneous equilibrium in goods and factor markets. The marginal rate of product transformation, as you might recall, is effectively the slope of the PPC curve. So here we have that value equals the ratio of the marginal costs of producing X and Y which in turn is equal to the ratio of the prices, right? And these two things must be equal, or can only be equal, under the assumption of perfect competition. And those in turn are equal to the marginal rate of substitutions for good X, between good X and Y for both consumers A and B, right? So in other words, it's setting this and this equal to each other effectively. That's what this last relation does, okay? The last condition. All right. So let's look at what these conditions look like in a graphical sense. Overview, the Pareto optimality in consumption. In the model, we have two individuals. They produce two goods and trade these between themselves to maximize their respective utilities. And the rate at which they trade will be determined by the marginal rates of substitution, right? The two individuals will benefit from trade as long as there is divergence between the marginal rates of substitution, right? So as long as MRS for A is not equal to MRS for B, there's room for gains to trade, right? Gains from trade. So they'll benefit from exchange if this condition holds. MRS A is not equal to MRS B. So the economic efficiency in consumption occurs when no reallocation of goods can increase the utility of A or B without thereby decreasing the utility of the other party. So this is what we call Pareto optimality. Okay, one tool we can use to depict this is the Edgewood Box or Edgewood-Bowley diagram, and this allows us to plot all the points where the MRS for A is equal to the MRS for B. Then we can connect all of these points in this Edgewood box, and this is known as that connection of points gives us a smooth line throughout the box, and we call that the contract curve, right? And every point on that contract curve in turn implies a point of Pareto optimality. Graphical analysis. So this graph just shows you the utility functions for A and B, A on the left, B on the right. And you'll notice they have different budget lines, they have different utility functions. What we want to do is combine these two utility functions on a single graph. That's what the Edgewood box does, right? This is the Edgewood box. This is just a combination of these two things. It takes the utility functions of A and B and just combines them in a single diagram. And it does so by taking this graph over here, B, and turning it 180 degrees anti-clockwise, and then just shifting it over the diagram of A, superimposing it over A. When you do that, you get something like this. And here you have three sets of utility functions for A and B. I made a little graphic just to show you what this looks like. So imagine that the blue utility function is A and the red utility function is B. And we want to come up with an Edgewood box. Given these two utility functions, then this is what we do, right? And of course, this is one pair of utility functions of many possible utility functions for A and B. Okay? And in fact, we could add some utility functions and do the same thing. And you'll notice that in some cases, you have tangency between the respective utility functions, in some cases not. But if you look at only those instances where there is tangency between the utility functions of A and B, and you connect all of those points, you get something like this contract curve. This is just an abstract idea, right? This is not a perfect sort of drawing of an Edgewood box, but this is just to give you a sense of how to construct an Edgewood box and how to come up with this contract curve. So every point on this contract curve is then a point of tangency between the utility functions of A and B. In other words, every point on this contract curve, on this black line, is a point of Pareto optimality. It's a point where one individual can be made better off, one consumer can be made better off only if the other consumer is made worse off. All right? So let's take a closer look at this this Edgewood box. So here we have the contract curve which goes from point OA to point OB. And along that curve, it shows you three instances of utility functions for both A and B So A's utility functions are labeled on the right there. And of course, A's utility functions are convex with respect to the OA origin, and individual B's utility functions are convex with respect to the OB origin. So that's B's origin point in the top right corner of this box, right? So these utility functions are convex with respect to that corner. And there are 3 points here, which are all Pareto optimal. These are RTS. So here, at each of these points, neither consumer can be made better off without the other one being made worse off. Now let's look at a point that is not Pareto optimal. It's this point over here, which I didn't label, but it lies somewhere off of the contract curve, right? So you can think of both of these consumers are lying on some indifference curve. Consumer B is indifferent between this point over here at the intersection of these two indifference curves and point T over there, right? Consumer A, on the other hand, is indifferent between that point at the intersection of these two indifference curves and point R given over here. So clearly this is an instance where either A or B can be made better off without making the other consumer worse off. So if we move to point T, for instance, now A is on a higher indifference curve than he was over here, right? So clearly he's better off, whereas individual B is indifferent, right? He wasn't made worse off by moving from the point over here at the intersection of UB2 and UA1 down to point T, which is the point of tangency between UA2 and UB2. Okay, so that is an example of a Pareto improvement in this economy. In other words, there's been a welfare improvement when we move from this point to that point. And how would they get to point T? Should they start out over there? That would happen through exchange, right? At this point, this is not a point of tangency between their respective utility functions. Therefore, their marginal rates of substitution are not equal at this point. And as we just discussed, that implies that through exchange, by trading goods X and Y among themselves, they can reach a point. They can do so and continue to do so until they reach a point where their respective marginal rates of substitution are equal, and they achieve a point of tangency between their respective utility functions. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why they can also move to point R. So in the case of moving from this initial non-optimal point down to point T, we made A better off while B's utility was unchanged. But we can also make B better off by moving to R, keeping A's utility unchanged. So which is it going to be? And that depends on the initial distribution of endowments, right? So how much A and B can consume respectively, how much of X and Y A and B end up with effectively depends on their initial endowments of capital and labor, right? It depends on how much they can produce. And how much they can produce depends on how much capital and labor they have respectively. But that's not something that is determined inside the model, right? So that's just given. Okay. Of course, given the scenario there, A would like to be at point T and B would like to be at point R, right? Remember, individuals maximize the utility. There's no room for altruism in this framework. But they end up at either R or T, depending on who was given the most capital and labor at the start of this process. Okay. All right. So on the graph, I won't go through this slide. This is just sort of discusses what we just did on the previous slide. So I'll skip this one and move on to talking about Pareto optimality in production. Okay, so Here we just repeat the same process that we did, but this time looking at it from the perspective of firms and the production of the two goods using labor and capital. So similarly to the case of consumption, Pareto optimality in production implies that it should not be possible to increase the output of one good without reducing the output of another good. In other words, production is happening very efficiently in this economy. Okay, in the two-sector model, we have two firms or two sectors which produce goods X and Y, maximizing production, and these firms maximize production for given inputs of labor and capital. Under perfect competition, each producer faces the same factor prices so that the marginal technical rate of substitution, that is the substitution of labor for capital in the production process, equals the ratio of the relative costs of production, right? So these firms have to pay themselves wages to produce, and they also have to pay interest on the capital or rent on capital to produce output. And the ratio of those two costs must equal the marginal rate of technical substitution. Okay? Under perfect competition, under that important assumption. And with this condition met, that is the equality of sector X and sector Y's marginal rate of technical substitutions, the economy is operating at a point on the contract curve for production. So we can again draw another Edgewood box for production. Here we now have sector X on the bottom left origin and sector Y on the top right origin. And here we have isoquants inside the Edgewood box instead of utility functions. You can think of the dashed lines as isocost lines. So X3's isoquants are convex with respect to the bottom left origin, and sector Y's isocosts or firm-wise isocosts are convex with respect to the top right origin. And these horizontal lines indicate the total quantity of labor, and the vertical lines indicate the total quantity of capital. Again, each point on the contract curve reflects a point at which the production of one of these goods, say good X, can only go up if the production of the other good goes down. Okay, so points E, F, and G on the contract curve are such points. Here we have a point Q, which is not such a point. So over here at point Q, we see that we're lying on isoquant Y2 and for sector Y, and isoquant X1 for sector X. And over here we can redistribute labor and capital in such a way that we end up at, say, point F, such that we increase the production of good X without reducing the production of good Y, right? So these isoquants reflect the same quantity of goods produced along each point on the isoquant. So if we move from Q down to F, we haven't changed the production of good Y, right? This is why sector Y is isoquant. However, we have increased, if we move from Q to F, we've moved from isoquant X1 for sector X to isoquant X2. So this increases the production of good X without reducing the production of good Y. Okay. Now you can take each point on this contract curve and you can plot it on a different graph called a PPC, Production Possibilities Curve, or Production Possibilities Frontier. So here we have good Y, the quantity of good Y produced on the Y-axis and the quantity of good X produced on the X-axis. And here we have points E, F, and G that are indicated on this slide over here, plotted or just labeled at points on this graph. Okay, and you'll also notice that we have point Q on the inside of this graph. So this is clearly point Q given over there in the Edgewood box corresponds to an inefficient point in the possibilities the production possibilities curve. Moving on. Now, I said condition 3 suggests that we have simultaneous equilibrium in production and consumption. So this condition for allocative efficiency merely requires that producers and consumers achieve equilibrium simultaneously. This indicates equality between the rate at which consumers are willing to substitute one good for another, that's the marginal rate of substitution, and the rate at which it is technically feasible to do so. Right? So that's the marginal rate of technical substitution. So in the graph on the next slide, this suggests equality between the slopes of VV prime and TT prime. So we'll look at that in a moment. Should the economy be producing at another point on the PPC, then MRPT is not equal to MRS or MRSA or MRSP. So the MRPT refers to the marginal rate of product transformation. That's just the slope of this production possibilities frontier, right? The marginal rate of product transformation. How much of good X must the economy stop producing to produce more of good Y? In other words, moving to the left of this curve. Likewise, going to the right, how much of good Y must the economy stop producing to produce more of good X? So moving from point E to point F, for instance. All right, so that's the MRPT, the slope of the production possibilities frontier. And when you have equality between that, the MRPT and the MRS, we have allocative efficiency in the economy. And that is shown on this graph over here. Okay? So here we have taken the Edgewood box for consumption, and we've put it inside of the production possibilities frontier. So remember, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but the horizontal lines in the Edgewood box for consumption indicate the total quantities of X and Y available for consumption. So the horizontal lines indicate the total quantities of X that are available for consumption. So this line and this line indicates how much of X can be consumed between A and B, and vertical lines indicate how much of Y can be consumed. That's the total amount that's being produced in this economy, right? And that the total of both of those are of course given at this point F over here. And that under all of our assumptions, perfect competition, etc., that point lies on the production possibilities frontier. Furthermore, the points of tangency, in other words, the slope at this point of the production possibilities frontier given by the point of tangency of this line TT prime is equal to the slope of the utility functions of A and B, which is also given by the slope of this line tangent to those respective utility functions labeled V prime. So these two slopes are equal. In other words, the line T prime and V prime are parallel. And when you have that situation, that is, the economy is producing at a point on the production possibilities curve, and you have equality between these two, the slopes of these two lines, that is the utility functions as well as the MRPT, marginal rate of product transformation, then you have allocative efficiency in the economy, right? Which means that firms are producing efficiently, maximizing production for given quantities of capital and labor, and individuals are simultaneously maximizing utility given the available resources in the economy, right? So we have maximized welfare at this point. Now notice that any other point on this production possibilities frontier is technically efficient, right? At any point on the line M, firms are maximizing output, but it is only at point F that we are maximizing allocative efficiency. It is only at point F that goods are being distributed among the consumers in the economy in accordance with their preferences and their initial distributions of endowments. Now there's this third type of efficiency that I said was introduced in the text called dynamic efficiency. And again, this just refers to growth in the economy. In other words, it refers to pushing out the production possibilities frontier. So if we start out with the line MONO in the economy, so here we have a production possibilities frontier, MONO. Dynamic efficiency implies shifting this curve out to, say, M1, N1, right? And landing on a point, say, C1. So if we move from CO to C1, the economy is technically efficient. The economy is allocatively efficient. Well, we don't know that because we don't see the Edgewood box inside here, but let's just assume for now that we are also allocatively efficient. And furthermore, we are dynamically efficient, right? Because the possibilities frontier is being pushed out. So more of both Y and X are being produced. And of course, this happens through the usual growth process, which requires investment in capital, investment in labor. In other words, perhaps developing human capital through education as well as technological change. So all three of those things are, and just adding more stuff, right? So adding more individuals to the economy, adding more capital to the economy, right? That's how we move from NO to N1. Okay. So the key points of all of this is that an allocation is Pareto optimal if any given individual's utility can be increased only by reducing the utility of at least one other individual. The set of Pareto optimal allocations of capital and labor map out a contract curve in the Edgewood box, and each point on that curve also corresponds to a point on the production possibilities frontier. Now, importantly, we made some assumptions to get to this analytical framework that tells us how we maximize welfare in an economy, where we take resources and we combine them, and through some production technology, we produce goods and services that households consume to maximize their utility. And those assumptions were no externalities and perfect competition, among a few other simplifying assumptions, right? Okay. But those assumptions don't hold, okay? In fact, as I mentioned at the start, the framework that we've been dealing with, neoclassical framework for a production economy, production and exchange economy, is a normative analysis, right? So now we're going to move into the more positive realm, and we're going to talk about how this model sort of fails to describe our reality.